Welcome everyone. Maybe you've come here because you don't really know what your name means. Maybe you're just curious about what Basque names are, where they come from. But that's what I'm going to be helping you guys out with today. So welcome in and get ready to learn. Strap in your seatbelts because we're going to be talking about Basque names. Now, Basque names are confusing. Maybe you guys have seen names like this before. You don't really know what they mean. Little complicated, right? Not really like the usual American last names that we see. So if we look at just the normal American names that we're used to probably in everyday life, Smith. Can anyone tell me what Smith means? Oh, well, a Smith is yeah, it's like a blacksmith, someone who works with metal. Does anyone know what a tailor is? Exactly, someone who makes clothes. A mason, laying bricks. Johnson, exactly, John's son, and then Bush. Exactly. You had a house near a bush, they just named you Bush. So American names are pretty easy to understand for the most part. But what about Basque names? That's what we're here to learn about today. They're a little bit more complicated. So let's start simple. First of all, first names. You know them, you love them. Let's have a little bit of fun with them. So I decided to do like a little case study. So throughout the 1700s, in this one village of Bidaray, I decided to look at every single first name that was given to children to see if this idiom was real. Maybe you guys have heard of it. It's tous les Basques s'appellent Jean et tous les Basques Marie. That's all Basque men are named Jean and all Basque women are named Marie. Is this true? Is it just a stereotype? That's what I really wanted to find out. So in this one village, at least in the 1700s, I wanted to check it out. And so if we look at the pie chart, the distribution of names is pretty uniform. There's a relative diversity, at least in the men's names in this case. So are all Basque men named Jean? The answer is sorta. About 1 in every 3. So every single house had like a little kid named Jean running around. But here's the thing. You guys know a lot of people named Jean in the Basque community, but do you always call them Jean, for example? No, not really. We have cooler names for that, like Ioannes, Manesh, Yoncho, Yuan, among many others. Maybe you guys have heard Ganish Kayet before. Does anyone know any other variations? No? Anyone named Jean that had like a cool nickname? Nah. Well, pardon? Jano, yeah. Jano is another nickname. Sometimes even in the Basque country they would call him Ñaño, which literally means dwarf, but it was more like an affectionate way of calling someone named Jano. And if you look at the house names in the area, since we are looking at names, you do see like Ioaneshenia, Ganishenia, Maneshenia. Essentially these are all John's house. Yuan Gourdo in this case is John the Fat, so they had a fat guy named Jean, they named a house after him. Ioaneshaura is, John the Kid. Ioanishto is Little John, and same thing for Ioanikot, which is another way of saying Jano. Yeah. Next up on the list, which was about 1 in every 4 men, was Pierre. Pierre is another very common last name you guys have heard around the Basque Center. But we don't always call people named Pierre, Pierre. Obviously, there are tons of diminutives. Maybe you guys have heard Peyo, Petrishko, Betiri, all these different versions of the Basque names in the area. And if you look at the house names in the same area that use the name Pierre, you have Betirishko, Pedioreña. This is essentially Little Pierre's house. Pierre Goria, which means, Pierre the Redhead, or Pierre the Red, if you want it to sound cool. Dom Perich is another way of saying John Pierre. Pelereña, Peledeña, other ways of saying, Pierre's house. Dominique is another common name, and at least for men in this case, and for women, as we'll see. But most of the times, we don't call someone named Dominique. We would say either Domingo, Dominique, different versions of it. In the area, there's actually a house name, which is Domingo Xereña, which is, Little Dominique's house. Oftentimes, you'll see that Basque names, they tend to add like a little bit of a diminutive to it. So if you're not just calling someone John, you're calling them like Little John because it's like more affectionate, It's more, yeah. Martin is next up on the list. Maybe you guys have heard of people in at least our community named Martin. Another common way of saying it is Machin, at least on the French side. And so house names in the area include Martinon, Machin Borda, which is literally Martin's shack, and Machi. Raymond is actually the first name on the list which is of Germanic origin and not Latin. Because the Basque country being a Christian country, which was Christianized throughout the 1300s, most of their first names came from the Bible or from Latin names. Raymond in this case is from a Germanic root. But what's interesting about Basque is that we don't usually have words that start with the letter R because that just doesn't sound Basque enough, So we decided to put a vowel in front. And that gives us, instead of Raymond, we get Erramon instead of Ramon in Spanish, for example, and Erramun, and then finally Erramuncho for Little Raymond if you guys are trying to be, a little bit more buddy-buddy with someone. And house names in the area include Erramuneña and Erramundegui. Yeah. There's also Shalvat. Maybe you guys have heard this name around. But this is from essentially the Basque version of the name Salvador or Salvador. And so we see Salvador, Shobat, Shabat, Shalbat, all different names to say Salvador. So in this case, we have Shobatahaya, which is a house name in the area. That's Salvador the tailor. As you can see, it's not just named Salvador Taylor. It's this. That's his name. Shobatioa is the little Salvador, and etc. Michel, though very common now, this became more and more common throughout the 1900s. Back in the day, Michel wasn't all that common. And oftentimes they would say Michel, Michel, or Miquel. Or in the case of Bidaray, which is right on the Spanish border or the border with Egoalde, we get Miguelenia, which is essentially Miguel's house. Yeah. Now, when we look at women's names, this gets a bit more interesting because as you could see, at least with men's names, it was relatively diverse. But in the case of women's names, there was a lot less diversity, at least in the official forms of the name. To the point where 97% of the women in this one village had the exact same 5 names. So there are 5 main names here. So are all women in this village named Marie? No, but sorta. About half of the women in this case were named Marie. But if you have so many Maries running on, it's to the point where each house had at least 2 Maries just, there. So they decided to, came up with cooler, more cutesy names to distinguish each child from the other. So you have Marie, which is usual Basque name. You have Maria, which was taken, from Hegoalde, for example. Manya, which is a way of saying, Marianne, or which became Mariana and then Manya. Mai, which is a kind of affectionate way of saying Marie. Martia, which is essentially Martha, but that became a sort of another pseudonym for Marie. So if we look at the area, we have a bunch of different house names for women named Marie. You have Martia Reña, Martha's house, Maria Aura Reña, which is Marie the kid's house. So if she was a kid and she had a house, that's the name of the house. Mañarena is Marianne's house. Maripushunea is an interesting house name in the area. It essentially means Marie's well's house. So this lady named Marie had a well. She had a house. They called the house Maripushunea. Yeah. Next is Jeanne, which is, the feminine version of John or Jane in English. Another very common name, though we don't see any house names in the area because oftentimes house names were more attributed to men, at least like in this area of the Basque Country. But instead of saying Jane or Jeanne, we usually say Yuana, Ganya, Yuana, Nana, etc. Different little ways of calling people named Jane. Gracian is next up on the list. Tons of different variations. Some of them sound like a little caricatural. You have Grashina, Grashusha, Grashi, Gratiana, Graciana, and Geshina. All different ways of calling someone named Gracian. Yeah. Next up is Catherine. And what's interesting is that because Catherine comes from the Latin root Catalina, all the Basque names that have to do with Catherine will come from that root. So oftentimes you'll know people named Katalin or Katisha or Katrina. These all come from that. And all cool little names is calling someone Catherine, which though in English it might not sound as Basque, we just use this. Dominique is interesting because in the official forms, in the official records, at least in French, in this case, Dominique was a unisex name. There were men named Dominique and women named Dominique. But oftentimes, orally in Basque, we would say Dominica or Dominche as opposed to Domingo and Dominiche, for example. Yeah. But if you find someone on the street and they say, my name's Marie, does that mean that they're Basque? Not exactly, even though 50% of the women in this case were. The way that you could tell if someone is Basque is their last name, because it tends to be very distinct. Oftentimes, some people don't usually are able to pronounce it. Maybe you guys have had that issue in everyday life. But we're going to be looking at the last name because that's essentially what defines a Basque. So then again, we've looked at these American names before, but what are the rough Basque equivalents of these names? Yeah, a little bit more complicated, maybe a few syllables longer, different orthography. Instead of Smith, you have Arotzarena Raustegi, which means, the Smith's house, as we'll see. Taylor becomes Dendarechea or Dendarenea. Mason becomes Arguindegi. Johnson becomes Joaneshinea. And Bush becomes Bero or Berueta. Yeah. So one thing that we notice is that this isn't just Smith. It's not just Taylor. It's the Smith's house, or the Taylor's house, or the Mason's house. Joaneshinea, they don't have Johnson. It's just you come from John's house. Therefore, you are John's, child, or in this case, descendant. And finally, for Berho Berueta, instead of bush, we just have it's the place with the bushes. So if you had a house around some bushes, it's called Berueta. So what we notice is that your identity, it's not tied to just your profession or, who your dad was. It's tied to your house, to the house in which your family was from. Oftentimes, even in the Basque Country, they would ignore last names entirely and just call you, your first name and then what house you're from. And so the house name is a very important, phenomenon, at least in Basque culture here. So if you're trying to find out what your last name means, you have to go back to a specific house. In the vast majority of cases, granted there are a few exceptions. And oftentimes, some house names are unique in the entire Basque country, and you can even trace back the exact village that your family was from way back, even if you don't know anyone from there. So as an example, my great-grandmother's last name was Anchorluki, but I didn't really know what this means. So I decided to do some digging, and a lot of the ways that I kind of became acquainted with Basque names was making my own family tree. Maybe you guys have done the exact same thing. You've seen that all the last names in your family tree are all weird and they mean completely different things. In my case, I could trace it back to a house founded around the early 1600s, which came from Ainsiburu Ordoki, which means the plateau at the end of the marsh. So this works perfectly because you're along a river, there's a sort of marshy terrain, and then there's a plateau on which the house is. Currently now is a place that makes cheese. So if you guys are ever in the area and are hungry, well, pop on by. And so in a house name, I mean, just to give you guys the basis, what exactly are we looking for? Got to remember that the house is a place. So you're going to be looking for little words that tell you that this is a place. So you have what's called the locative suffix. This essentially is just telling you it's a place. So you have eta, for example, in the name Beroeta. The eta in this case is the place of Berho, the bushes. Aga, like in the name maybe Kuruchag you've heard, Kuruchaga means the place of the crossing. Doi, di, and se are all different ways of saying a plantation, an area of a certain, for example, kind of wood. If you look at Amestoi, that's the place with the oaks. And then ate and tegi are all different ways of saying just place. So maybe you guys have heard of the name Garate or Garat. That means the high place or the place above everything else. Okay, so now that we know that, let's look out for some more common or, well, other locative adjectives. Because usually you know that it's a place, but where exactly is this place on the scale of everything else? So maybe you guys have heard in certain Basque names, Garai or Goiti. That means above. So if your house was above the church, it would be Elisagarai. Or maybe it was just a house that was above other houses, so it's Echegarai, above the house. There's also Goyen. So if your house was high above everything else, like in the name Goyenech or Echegoyen, that means that your house was the highest above. It's the superlative of Goy in this case. Behiti, below, or Behere as well. So if your name was Echebeher, Echebehere, that means that you were the house below everything else. Same thing for Pe and Be, all different ways of ending. So in the name Harispe, that means below the oaks. So you're either below or above. And there are other adjectives in this case that show you kind of, well, where your house is. You have ondo, which is near. So if you had the name La Rondo, that means that you're near the prairie or the pasture, which isn't quite like La Ralde, alde meaning next to. So you're either near something, next to something, close to something. Exactly. Arte means that you're in the middle or between. For example, if you're Errecarte is your name, that means that you're between the streams. Or buru at the end of, maybe you guys have heard of the name Oyarburu, which contrary to popular belief does not mean chicken head. It means actually at the end of the forest, buru meaning the end, and then oyan becomes oyar, the forest. Yeah. There's also some less common adjectives that you guys might have heard in last names around the area. Baster, meaning, well, kind of away, isolated. Bakoits, it's the same idea of isolation. If your house is way out, just in the middle of nowhere, your name would be Eche Bakoits, or maybe Basterech. Berce just means the other house. So if your name was Echebest, for example, that just means that they weren't very creative in coming up with the name of your house. They're like, well, there's this house, and that's the other house. Gois is a more poetic way of saying, well, off in the east. Gois in Basque means the morning. So if you come from like, for example, Laregois, that means the pasture of the rising sun in the east, where the sun rises in the morning. Bustan is another way, for example, maybe you guys have heard the name Larrebustan or Orpustan. That means, well, literally, if buru is the head, bustan is the tail. It means at the end of. Yeah, and here's the thing. You might know where your house is compared to everything else, but oftentimes your last name is talking about your house specifically and where it comes from. So maybe you guys know your colors in Basque. Can anyone tell me what shuri means? White. Belts, urdin, and gorri. Exactly. If your house is a certain color, they would say, for example, echeshuri is the white house. There's also the age of the house that tends to matter, like berri, new. Right, so echeverry becomes, exactly. And so maybe you guys have heard the name Echesar or Echeshar. That means the old house, because sar in Basque is old. Oftentimes, well, turned into sharra. So in the name Ansharte Sharra or Ansharte Shahar, that means the old house in the marsh. We'll get to that. Size is also important because, well, if your house is a certain color, you don't know if it's a small red house or the big red house. So you have handi, which is big. So if you hear the name Eche Handi, that's the big house. Or Eche Tipi or Eche Tyo, that means the small house. Yeah. So they're kind of the basic adjectives. But now we need to talk about the land where your house is. Because sure, your house might be a certain color, it might be big, but where is it really? So now we need to talk about a little bit about the geography of the Basque Country. You can either be up in the mountains, as is most of the cases, so you'll see these words. Mendi, obviously, being mountain. If your name is Etchemendi, that means that you have a house in the mountain. Hegi is a ridge or a peak, the same sort of meaning as Biscay. So if your last name is Biscay, that means that you're, or Hegi in this case, means that you're somewhere in a mountain range. It's kind of a vague word. Ibar is a plain. Haran is a valley. So if you come from a house that's in the middle of the valley, it might be Haranarte, which means in the middle of the valley. Munho is a little hill. Ordoki is a plateau, as we saw in the name Anchordoki. And Sabal is a flat. So the name Sabalet or Sabaleta basically means the house on the flat, the place of the flat. Yeah. But here's the thing. Not all families used to live way up in the mountains, kind of the rugged terrain that you would expect to see in the Basque Country. No, the Basque Country is known for its rolling hills. This obviously is not the Basque Country. This is the Windows XP background. But as you can see, Larre, for example, is a pasture. Choro is a prairie. So if maybe you guys have heard the name Larralde, next to the pasture, Chorondo, around the plain, close to the plain, or the prairie. Landa and Elge are both words that mean field. So if your last name is Landa, that just means that your family had a field and that the house was in it. But maybe you got the short end of the stick. You weren't able to establish a house by these beautiful rolling green hills. You got stuck with the forest, in the middle of the forest perhaps. And that's where we get certain names in regards to trees and woods. So maybe you guys have heard the name Oyanarte or Oyarburu. That really means in the middle of the forest or at the end of the forest. Basho, like in the name, for example, Bashaguren, that's at the end of the forest as well, or the woods. And then names of trees. So like Ametz, Haritz, all different ways of saying oak. Gastan, which means chestnut. So if your house was on a road with chestnuts, you would have the name Gastanbide, for example. Okay, so that was a lot. It's a lot of little names of geography that you need to know. But why theory when we could practice a little? So let's try some examples. Let's look at the most common last names in that village that we just saw, right? Anchordoki. Does anyone remember what it means? Exactly. It's the plateau at the end of the marsh. Ordoki, plateau. Anch is like Ainsi, like in the name Ancharte Shahar. It became Ancharte Shahar. Well, Anch, Ainsi. It's the marsh. Yeah. Does anyone know what these very common last names mean? Echeverry? Echeshuri? And Echegaray? Exactly. It's the new house, the White House, and the high house. So if you had a pretty basic house and you want to know exactly where it comes from, well, it's the new house, the White House, or the house above. Yeah. Sedarri. Does this ring a bell for anyone? Does anyone here speak Basque and might know what this means? Yeah, that's all right. It means the border. It's literally the rock limit. Arri meaning rock, and Seda meaning the limit. So back in the day, they didn't used to have set borders. They used to just throw a rock on the ground and say, my village is here, yours is there. That's that. And if some guy decided, hey, I want to build a house right at this rock, well, they get the name Sedarri. Iturralde. Maybe you guys have heard this last name. Pretty common. Does anyone know what it means, perhaps? Close to the fountain, close to the river. Yeah, Iturri is a fountain, or it's a place where water comes out. Alde means next to. So if your last name is Iturralde, that means that you were literally next to the fountain. Yeah. Larralde, same concept. Can anyone tell me what this means? Exactly, next to the pasture. So if your name is Larralde, you were, well, next to the pasture, and Iturralde, next to the fountain. Borda. Now, this is probably my favorite last name of all time, possibly. I think it's simple, concise, straight to the point. Does anyone know what it means? Exactly. It's a barn or a shack. It's just a stack of wood. Because essentially, back in the day in the Basque Country, a lot of people were shepherders. They used to have to bring their sheep around. And it wasn't as simple as just, walking your dog around the block or to the usual park just so that, well, the dog could pee and then you could go home, right? No, when you were herding sheep, you would be gone for days, if not weeks at a time, with a massive flock of sheep just going up into the mountains where all the green fields are. So you couldn't really live at your house while you're doing that. So what the shepherds used to do, they used to build themselves up a little shack in the mountains, and they would live there for like a week. And then eventually, as the village expanded and it got closer to the mountains, that shack would become a house. But they still didn't decide to call it just house. They decided to call it a shack. And that's where borda comes from. Muhape. Does this name ring any bells? Pardon? Oh, Muhape. Muhape comes from below the border. This name especially originated in Oses. So it originally came from muga, meaning border, and then pe, below. It's like in the name Arispe, below the oaks. Mugape is below the border. Oftentimes G turns into H. This is a common process in Basque. We'll get to that. Next up is Amestoy. Common last name. Maybe you guys have heard it. Does anyone know where it might come from, perhaps? It's an oak forest, because stoy is like, well, a lot. Amets, meaning an oak. So if there's a lot of oaks, it's pretty much an oak forest. So if your name is Amestoy, your family probably lived by an oak forest. Videgaray, maybe you guys know this last name. Does anyone know what it means? Exactly. It's above the road. So if someone built a road and then your family decided we're going to build a house above it, you get this last name. Camino. Chemin, exactly. Road. But hey, that's not Basque, is it? That's Spanish. Now, one thing we have to realize is that a lot of Basque names don't come from Basque roots. They're often borrowed from Latin, Spanish, or French. And so in the area, I've just taken out a few names that don't exactly come from Basque directly. You guys have heard of the name Lambert, Lambert, common in the French Basque Country at least. That's from Germanic. It means beautiful land. So someone came along the Basque Country and decided, yeah, I'm going to name my family this. Ripa comes from Latin, ripa meaning the side of a river, la rive in French, for example. So if your house was on the side of a river, it was either uhalde, on the side of the river, well, by the water, or ripa, same concept. Saint-Esteban is the name of another town under its French name in the Basque Country. In Basque, this would be Donestebe. Noblia means noble, so if your family was noble, they had this name. And then Arlan, by the same concept that we saw, Raymond become Erramun, Roland becomes Arrolan, and then Arlan by contraction. Yeah, so let's go back to some more traditional Basque names. Maybe you guys have heard of Saldain? Does that ring any bells? It's a footbridge. So if there was a little creek and your family decided to build a house on a little bridge, Saldain became your last name. Insaurgarate, this is a bit more complicated. Does anyone have any ideas what this could mean? Exactly. It's the house with the nut trees. Garate, like in the name Garat, means the place, a high elevated place. And Insaur is a nut tree. So if your name was Insaur Garat, that meant that you were on a place above the nut trees. Joregi. Does this ring any bells for anyone? Maybe you guys know someone named Joregi. Castle, exactly. It's a stately home. It's, literally, etymologically speaking. But it's a castle or a place where nobility was. So if your family had any of the following names, Joregi, Yaureche, Shala, or Echepare, that means that they were noble at some point, or at least their family came from a noble house. So Yaur comes from Yaun in Basque, meaning Lord. So maybe you guys have heard, Yaun Echeverry, that means Mr. Echeverry. In this case, he's from a new house, not exactly Joregi, castle. Yeah. So if you guys had any of these last names in your family tree, you guys probably came from a noble house. Ibar, as we saw, is just another word for a plain or a field. Pretty straightforward. Same thing for Hegi. If your last name was Hegi, that means that you guys were most likely somewhere up in the mountains where there was a ridge or a peak. Istilarte, maybe you guys have heard the name Istil, Idoy, or Lohi. These are all different ways of saying that it was just kind of muddy. So if your name was Istilarte, Istilar.
You pronounce the G in Dutch?
Oh, no, sorry. Oftentimes what the French standardization of Basque last names does, that instead of having arte, for example, you get art in English. So if you think of the name Echarte, the middle house, Echart is, the middle house as well, just without the E at the end, because French people don't like Basque. Yeah. So in this case, if you were in the middle of the marsh, that's, Istilarte or Istilar, if you want to, sound French. And so your house was in the middle of the mud. Tough luck. Insavi comes from Ihins, meaning a place that has like a lot of rushes or reeds. And then Abi or Ibi is, a small stream. So if your house was in Ihinsibi or Ihinsabi, you would have a stream of rushes. Now, Echepare. This is a very common last name. Maybe you guys have heard Echepar around in the Basque community. Does anyone know what this might mean? Aha. Now, you see, for a long time, people thought that it was pareak, like in Basque, pears, and then eche, a house. We used to think that it was, two houses, and that became one house, and that became Echepare. But as we saw with Joregi, it actually comes from a noble house. So the Latin word for the most important place in the entire village is capitale, which became capital in English. So you guys have heard capital city, capital building. Capitale in Latin became Capale in Vulgar Latin. So after the Romans went around, they kept Latin, but the Romans sort of left. So then they got Capale. And Capale became in Basque Gapare, meaning main or principal. And then with Echegapare, we saw that G turns to an H. So you have Echepare, which is the main house. I know. It's a long story. It's a hybrid Basque Latin name. Pretty interesting. But if your last name was Echepar, it means that you guys came from the most important house in the village. So congrats, you ran the place. Orategaray is a name more specific to Bidaray. I don't know if you guys know anyone with this last name. Does anyone know what it means, perhaps? Yeah, it's above something, but that something is the place of the juniper trees. Orhe in Basque is, well, a juniper tree. So, for example, the name Orpustan, that's at the end of the juniper trees. In this case, Orategaray is above the place of the juniper trees. Now, I want to finish off at least this one segment with probably the most interesting last name in this village. And that's Murguiar in French, or Murguiarte in Basque. Now, we already say that there's arte, meaning in the middle. So this is the middle of something. But Murgi is a very, very, very old last name. Like before the Romans even came around, Latin was never heard of in the Basque country. And there was another language called Iberian. So Murgi in Iberian literally meant made of the mountain. Because oftentimes, if you built a house in the mountain, you weren't going to go all the way down to the middle of the village to grab a rock and lug it all the way up the hill. You would just take the rocks around and build a house. So it's literally the middle house that's made of the mountain. Mur or mun in Basque, like munho, meaning hill or mountain, and then gi, made of, so maybe you guys have heard ogiki, made of bread. Well, in this case, murgi is made of the mountain. Yeah. So that was a lot. I know it's a lot of last names to keep under your belt, but now that you've understood where they come from, well, last names and all, it's time to understand how they're formed, and that's where house names come in, right? Because all last names come from a house name, or for the most part. So I decided to do a little bit of research in the village of La Carra, or La Carre in French, which is a village not too far from Donibane-Garassi or Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port. So let's do some simple ones. Does anyone remember what Arostegui means? It's the smith's house, exactly. Borda? Yes. Cambo is a little bit harder. It's the name of another village in the area from Lapurdi. So Cambo-les-Bains in French, Cambo in Basque. Iturria? Fountain. And Salaberry? Yeah. It's the new stately house or the new noble house. And if you hear the name maybe Yauregi Berri, that means also the exact same thing, because Shala and Yauregi are both names to call a noble house. It's a good job. Yeah. So you guys are learning fast. You guys already kind of know the layout. Give yourself a nice big pat on the back. Exactly. So remember, we always want to be looking out for that etch root, or etche, right? Maybe you guys have it in your own last name. It's house. So in the case of etchart, does anyone know what that means? Yeah, between the houses, the middle house, eche and arte in the middle. So etchart, echarte, middle of the house. Yeah, or well, it's a house in the middle. Gets a little complicated. Echeshuri, exactly. And by extension, if you have echeshuri berri, exactly. So one person made a white house, you made one next to it, yours is newer. That's your last name. Echegoña, which is just a fancy, well, or less fancy way of saying Echegoyen. Does anyone know what that means, perhaps? Yeah, it's the highest house above the highest above. Echeverico Borda. We're getting there. It's well, Echeverry. It's the shack of the new house. Yeah. Ta-da. And then Karakoish is just a fancy way of saying Garaiko Echea, which means the house from above, literally. Good job. Sort of got it down. Okay, so now for a little speed round. Obviously, we're not going to go through these too much in detail. We're just going to rapid fire through some house names that are in the area. Subialde, maybe you guys have heard Subi, like in the name Subiri or Subiburu. That's the bridge. So Subialde. Exactly. Errecartia. Yeah, because Erreca, stream, Artia in the middle. So it's in the middle of the streams. Your house is right there. Gaineko Borda. That's right. We always come back to shacks. That's something I've learned. But it's literally the shack from above, or it's, well, the shack that's, because oftentimes you're not going to make a shack in the middle of the village. People wouldn't really like that. So you often made it up in the mountains. Harispe, maybe you guys have heard this name around. Pe, below. Haritz, the oaks. So you're below the oaks. Maybe you're in the shade. It's kind of nice. Harispuru, same concept of buru or puru, meaning the end of. And then haritz, again, the oaks. So in this case, you're at the end of the oaks. Ihistareña, it's the hunter's house. Because in Basque, ihistari, the hunter. So therefore, if your ancestor decided he liked to kill a few wolves every once in a while, well, he gets the last name Ihistareña, or that becomes the name of his house. Lashkoitya, a little bit complicated. It comes from lacha, meaning like, well, a river. Maybe you guys have heard the name Lashtiri. That literally means the house of the river. In this case, Lashkoitya is above the river, because goiti, as we saw in Basque, above, lacha, the river, above the river. Lohigori, as we saw, instead of isil, in this case, it's red silt. Lohi is kind of like, well, silt, sedimenty, marshy part of the area. And gorri, because it was red, maybe you guys have seen red mud around before. If your house was there, that was the last name you got. Oyenarte, this is when your family really, well, did not choose their placement wisely. They were in the middle of the forest. So maybe it's hard to get in there, but arte, the middle. Oyan, oyana, maybe you guys have also heard the name oyararte or oyamburu. This all comes from the forest. Okay, so now we know all that. Congrats. I know it's a lot to take in. Let's do something a little challenging. Yeah, it gets worse. So, for some background, I decided to look at some old Basque maps from like the 1800s, as you do. You know, I was bored one day and decided, let's look around. And that's when I came across this absolute monstrosity of a name.
Oh my God.
I know it's hard to read, but written out normally, that takes up the entire screen. Just, yeah. Does anyone want to attempt to pronounce it? Congrats! Wow, that's better than my first try, that's for sure. Yeah. Close, actually. Now, one thing you have to remember is that there already is a house called, or another shack really, called Belsauske, or Belsautska, as it should be called in Basque, because, again, French people don't like Basque, so they decided to change it up a little bit, make it sound a bit more, you know. Yeah. But Belsauska is what it is in Basque. And so we know that this is a shack, right? So everything in regards to Belsautska, this other house or shack that it depended of, is talking about what this shack, borda, is in regards to it, if that makes sense. Right? So, sorry. So, no spoilers, I apologize. So I would say a borda, the shack, and ko, which is of. For example, you could say esquale rico, nice. Ko, in this case, is from. So in this case, the shack from Gainekua Belsautska. Yeah. So if you look, Gaine is above, as we saw with Gaineko Borda. That means, well, the shack from above. Gaine meaning above, and then Kua, like in Lekua, is a place. So in this case, it's the shack above the place. No, the shack of the place above. You have to look at it backwards in Basque. The shack of the place above Belsautska, right? But it gets more complicated, because why not have a little bit more fun? Because Belsautska also means something in Basque. It's not just, they didn't just find a shack and name it Belsautska because it sounded nice, well, anyway. We can divvy it up, because ka in Basque, or Belsautska, the ka is a diminutive form, just like saying kyo or nyo, it means small. Does anyone know what belts means? Exactly. And aus, I'm not sure if that rings a bell. It's another way of saying aitz, which is in Basque, rock, rocher, a big, rocky thing. So in this case, it's little, ka, black, aitz or aus, and then, well, rock. Wait, that was the wrong order. But yeah, it's the little black rock in this case. So can anyone attempt to say what this massive word possibly means? Yeah, we're getting there. It's literally the shack of the place above the little black rock. Oddly specific. If you wanted to get directions to this place, just listen to the name, you'll probably find it. Not too many places where there's a shack above a place above the little black rock. Yeah. So congrats, you guys know Basque now. So who now can reflect on their own name and figure out what their own name means? Does anyone have any last names that they? Exactly. And can you tell me what that means now? Exactly. It's the house that's the highest above. If Echegaray is the house above, your house is even higher. So congrats. Goyeneche, above. Gorostiag. Do you have any idea what that means? Well, Well, the fact that it's Gorostiag, well, with g at the end, means that it was Frenchified, unfortunately. It comes from Gorostiaga, aga meaning, well, a place. And then Gorosti is another way of saying holly or a kind of plant. Looks really pretty, has these little red berries. Maybe you guys have seen it. So Gorostiaga, that means that your house is in a place surrounded by holly. Yeah. Anyone else have any last name? Pardon? Exactly. Do you know what it could possibly mean? Now, in this case, it's it was taken originally from Eche and Barren. So maybe you guys have heard the name Barreneche, Barnech, or maybe Iribarren, Iribarren. So in this case, the Barren means the most interior. So if your last name was Echebar, for example, Echebar, that means the house sort of in the interior of the village. If your name was Echebarren, which became Echarren just by processes of Basque speech, that was the house on the most inside. So your house is smack dab in the center of the village. So congrats, you guys must have been, well, quite a meeting spot. Yeah. And yeah, I guess, does anyone else have any other? By the way, this is like the end of the presentation, like full disclosure. So if you guys have any, because normally after it's supposed to be a Q&A, but I do want to hear a bit more about your guys' last names. So feel free. Yeah.
But is that A-O-U-S?
Oh. In Basque it would be, well, Oscarriaga, except Oscarriaga is a very interesting name because it's pretty old. We know that Ag, like in Gorostiag or Gorostiaga, Aga means the place. So if your last name had Aga or Eta or Ate, that probably meant a place. Now, the rest is a little bit more complicated, and scholars actually aren't exactly, well, they don't share the same views on what your name is. Some people think it's one thing, some people think it's another. One possible explanation is Hauch, meaning dust, and Gorri, meaning red, Aga. So Auch Gorriaga became Auscarriaga, which became Oscarriag in French. So in that case, that would mean that your house was in the place of the red dust, or, which is my personal belief, but granted, I'm not at all an authority on Basque linguistics by any means. I think it's probably from, well, heights, which became house, as we saw in Belsauske, right? House meaning rock, carri, which means, well, another way of saying rock, and then aga. So your place was basically the quarry that had rocks, if that made sense. Yeah. So maybe you guys have heard the name Hardoy. That means a quarry as well. Pardon?
That's more likely.
That's what I think. But granted, I have my own views. If you guys think it means something else, try to find a little analysis for it. And yeah. Any other names in the area?
How about Arduin?
Arduin. Oh wow, that one's actually tough. Now, one thing is that Ardu, I know that, well, Ardi in Basque is sheep. Sometimes there are names with that. More likely it's probably from Ardu, which is the Sultan way of saying wine. So if your name was Arduin, I think that means that, well, your family made wine. So they were the house with the wine. I'd have to double check though. Yeah. Pardon? Wait, could you spell that? Oh yeah, okay. So another word in Basque, which I didn't exactly get to, is ainsi, meaning in front. So ainsiburu, actually, wait, no, in that case, ainsi can either mean marsh or in front. So if you say, well, ainsi, it's either in front, or ainsin, ainsina, for example, in the dance step, ainsina pika, that means going in front. Ainsi usually means in front of. And erdois is actually another name that's kind of fooled scholars a lot. Some people think it comes from the word rust, meaning like erdoi or erdoil, and then ainsi. But most of the time, people think that it comes from erdi, meaning in the middle. So, yeah, still a lot of debate. That I'd have to double check, but usually that's what people assume it comes from. Yeah. Iribarren, right? So what's interesting is that iri became, well, partially a word for village. So iri in this case would be in the village. But iri in Old Basque, back when they made all the house names, back when they, I guess, all came together and decided, okay, my house is going to be this, your house is going to be that. Iri just meant house or domain. So barren, like in the name Echarren or Echebarren, that meant like the most interior. So if your house was iri barren, that means it was the middle of the village. Yeah. Osafran is a very interesting one. What's crazy about the name Osafran is that it's been around since the Middle Ages. People don't exactly know where it comes from, but the fact that there's an F there in Osafran, because F wasn't originally in Basque. If we want to think of the Latin word for fern, which is fagu, right? That became bago or pago in Basque. The F turns usually into a B or a B or a P. So in the case of the name Osafran or Osafran, well, the F means that like it wasn't there originally at some point. What people think it actually is well, someone messed up along the way. One of the scribes screwed up and wrote from the word Osherain, which maybe you guys have heard of the village named Aucherin-Rivaret in French, or I believe it's Aucharain in Basque. Most likely it comes from that village, and then someone, instead of writing an S, they used to write a long S, so it's basically an F without the bar, and so people just confuse that. So yeah, although people still, essentially, your name is so like your name is really old. It's been around for a while, and so people still don't really know where exactly it came from, and there's still a lot of raging debate going on about where do Basque names come from. Yeah.
Still got to today. That's wonderful.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that at least when someone would mess up and write it, and write it wrong, you would still be taught that that's your last name, because the French teachers in school would be like, oh yeah, this is your name, this is how it should be, and that's how we end up with names like Gorostiag, Oscariag. They would take off the last A, add an E, because it sounds more Frenchy. So oftentimes names are changed over time. You just got to look out for that. Yeah.
What about Urbina?
Urbina. Hold on. That one might have actually stumped me. Urbina. I don't know if it's from Urdina the Blue. Most likely not. I'd have to double check. I can double check that for you.
I don't know. I think Urbina is a town in the Basque Country, well, the Spanish Basque Country. From what I don't know, I kind of did my research, but I don't know. Maybe I don't know, a different.
Sure, I can double check that for you. It does sound more Spanish Basque. So if it comes from a town, if there's a town called Urbina, then your name is probably from that. As we saw, like town names ended up becoming last names when you move to another town. So it might come from that originally. I'll double check for you though. Yeah. Good. Now, Camus is a very interesting name. It's one that stumped me because, well, there are a lot of people named Camus here in San Francisco. And I've always wondered, what exactly does this mean? Some people told me Camus comes from the word for deer. But what's interesting about Camus is that it's a very, very old name. Maybe you guys know the name Gamere-Sihiga, the village in the Basque Country in Chiberua. Well, Gamere or Camus in French, we don't exactly know where the word comes from originally, but often what we've seen is that it means like somewhere in regards to a hot spring. So there are hot springs in Camus, or in, for example, Canbo, which comes from Camus originally. So if your house was Camus, that means that a long, long time ago, back before the Basque language was what it was today, probably meant that your house was by a hot spring. Yeah.
That's why they called it Camus du Vin?
Yeah. So the French name for Canbo is Cambo-les-Bains, i.e. the baths. So they usually had hot springs in that case, and people would go take baths in it. So that's why they named the village that, because it was known for its hot springs, and hence the name Camus came about. Yeah.
My parents' surnames, my mom's birth name was Sabarots, S-A-B-A-R-O-T-S. Is that Basque?
Yeah. Now, Shabarots is another name that people aren't exactly, they're not, everyone thinks that they know where it comes from, but no one's really sure. Now, the belief I subscribe to is that it comes from Shapar, which means like thorns. So, for example, in the name, you guys have heard Lapar or Shapar, all different ways of saying places that have a bunch of thorns. And Och is just another way. Och, technically in Basque, means noise. Most likely it's not that. It's probably just a place that had a lot of thorns. So if your name was Shabaroch, which is actually a name I found in my own family tree, at least in the village of Makai. I'm not sure if that's where your family's from. Yeah. So there is actually a house called Shabaroch in Makai. Although, yeah, we're not sure exactly, but most likely it's built on the word Shabar, meaning thorns. Yeah. Yeah.
My surname, La Peyrade, that's Bernais, isn't it?
La Peyrade is Bernais.
Anything with EYR is Bernais, right?
Most likely, but La Peyrade in this case comes from essentially the Occitan word Peyrade, which in French is Pierraille. It's essentially a place with a lot of rocks. So if your name is La Peyrade, that means that, well, that was the quarry. That's where they just had a bunch of rocks. And so, yeah. Anyone else? I mean, Also Garay. So as we saw, Garay means above. And also, in this case, probably comes from Alchu, which really means a lot of, hold on, actually, I don't know quite the word in English. I know it in French. In French, it's the word aulne. Let's see. Yeah, it's a kind of tree. It's the alder tree. Yeah, so Alts, maybe you guys have heard the name Alchacho, for example. In this case, Alzo Garay is a place above the place that has alder. This kind of tree. Yeah. Any questions? Any other names that were maybe floating around your head?
When I was a kid, Iribarne Garay.
So if you have the name Iribarren or Iribarne, yeah, it's funny because there are a lot of random names that are super long. The longest one I've heard is Aguirre Gomez Corta, which Doesn't sound like much, but written down, it's I think like 15 letters or something crazy, or like the name Anchatechara, for example. But in this case, Iribarnegaray is the house above the house that's in the very middle, or the most interior house. So if your family name was Iribarne, yeah. So you guys are kind of getting all the directions of the village. This house is in the middle, your house is right above. So, yeah.
Can I ask, I'm not Basque, but can I ask the Basque language a little bit about it?
Sure.
How many letters?
Letters.
An alphabet? Is there an alphabet?
Yeah, usually the alphabet that's adopted, at least by Common Basque today, I think is like 26 letters technically, because there are a lot of letters that are used in loanwords. Like the letter C doesn't really exist in Basque because we have K, like K, and we have S, which oftentimes uses a C, for example, in Spanish or French, which we just use as Z. So in this case, it's the entire normal alphabet that you'd be used to in English, minus letter C and plus the Spanish letter ñ, which is like ñ. So maybe you guys have heard the name Niño. That means very, very small, but they're just using ñ a lot to make it sound kind of small. So, yeah. But as we've seen, Basque is really a language that, though it borrowed heavily from French, Spanish, Latin, originally it's a language that's not really related to anything else. It's its own thing apart. Yeah. Any other names that we're looking out for? Anything that's confusing you guys? Dagoret, yeah, that's actually interesting because oftentimes the letter D in French was the determinate article. So if you want to say you're from Paris, you'd say de Paris. Or if it was something that started with the letter A, for example, let's say, what's a city that starts with the letter A?
Avignon.
Yeah, let's say you're from Avignon. So you were d'Avignon, like D from Avignon. So in this case, the D from French, like in the name Daguerre, or Duhalde, for example, the D comes from French originally, but if you take off the D, that's most like its original Basque form. In this case, it's agoret or agoreta. Agor in Basque is like dry. So if you were on places where it didn't rain a lot, it was very dry, it wasn't really perfect for farming. And then eta, like in et, means the place of. So if you're dagoret, that means that you're from the place where it's very dry. Yeah. Any other names around, or? All right, well, it seems you guys learned everything you're looking for. Thank you all for coming. I see my computer disconnected automatically. But yeah, thank you very much. I hope you guys all enjoyed.